Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. May peace and blessings be upon our Prophet and his family. So I'm your host for this afternoon, Seema Duhan, and I manage Zaytuna's community engagement program. Usually through this community engagement program, we go out to the broader audiences across the country and with our scholars giving talks on different topics, teaching classes, to kind of create literacy about the mission and vision of Zaytuna College. And here we are today on the campus, first time, because we have a scholar who is coming from somewhere else to Zaytuna College, mashallah. So I really thank your presence here. I thank my colleagues, staff, faculty, Dr. Qureshi for always guiding and helping in every possible manner. I would also like to give you outline of today's program. So after me, Dr. Jawad Qureshi will introduce our guest for for today. And after that, Dr. Celene will give her presentation. And lastly, audiences can ask the questions, and the preference will be given to Zaytuna students. I hope you all will comply with that. And that's all, and let's start the journey. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. There we go, okay. I thought the mic was off. Alhamdulillah. It's a pleasure to have Dr. Celene Ibrahim visiting us here at Zaytuna. Alhamdulillah, she spent the earlier part of her day with our students, and they've all seemed really excited about having her here. So we're really pleased to have her here. She comes to us she's teaching currently at the Groton School in Boston. In Massachusetts, she'd finished her PhD at Brandeis University. Her talk today is, it comes from what's her forthcoming book, Women Figures in the Qur'an, which is tentatively titled Women Figures in the Qur'an by Oxford University Press. Alhamdulillah, Quranic studies is in a very burgeoning phase right now. Much of what dominated the way in which the Qur'an was studied in the West has, people have moved on from that. Questions of, when does we actually date the history of the Qur'an? Can we date it to the 7th century? Can we date it? There was a school of thinking that kind of held everybody's minds from thinking originally about the Qur'an and actually saying they're more concerned with the question of when we can date the Qur'an to what the Qur'an actually says. So you would find people that would say, for example, the Qur'an comes not from the time of the Prophet ﷺ, but it comes from a few centuries later. It's a product of these inter-Arab debates between Christians and Jews, 3rd century of the Hijra, 2nd century of the Hijra. And then there's, recently they found these manuscripts of the Qur'an at Birmingham University and other places, and they carbon dated them. And they carbon dated them to within 70 years of the life of our Prophet ﷺ. And that kind of ends the discussion for a lot of people. But some people said, you know what, there's a range on that, right? It can be 20 years before the Prophet and then 20 years after. So now they're trying to say the Quran was before the Prophet, so you can't win. So alhamdulillah. But what happened is that people have turned the conversation, they've gotten past this problem of the history of the Quran to look at what the Quran actually says. And this is a very good vista for us. It's a new horizon that's really beneficial for us, because now we can actually start to ask ourselves, well, instead of reading the Quran to try and find out what its date is, what is actually being told to us? Who are the people that are speaking? What are the voices that are here? What is the author of the Quran, God, trying to convey? And what we have with Dr. Celene's talk and her book, which I'm really excited and looking forward to, is a focus on the Quranic figures, not taking one individual. This is the story of Mary, and there's books that have been written about Maryam alayhi salam in the Quran, not taking Asiya as another figure of the Quran, a female figure of the Quran, or taking Hawa as another figure of the Quran, but looking at the entirety, the ones that are named, the ones that are not named, the ones that are implicitly stated there, and what their voice is, right? This broader picture. So I am personally very excited to hear Dr. Celene's contribution to Quranic studies and what it'll tell us about the Book of Allah and ways in which we can, bring that into our own lives and our own readings of the Quran. And I hope you guys hope you'll enjoy it as well. So without any ado, I'll welcome Dr. Celene. Thank you.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. I'm so pleased to be here and to be witnessing this moment in Zaytuna's development. It feels to me like the flower that is just beginning to see colors and opening. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to continue to place barakah in this institution and to shower all the people who come to it and through it with the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and with all the blessings of ilm. And may we, all of those who visit here, be enriched by the presence and return again frequently. So I'm pleased to be returning to Zaytuna and to find it in a great state of iman and to be enriched by all of your presence here tonight. I ask peace and blessings upon the beloved Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and I ask that our hearts be present here together and that there be benefit in our gathering and that we benefit from what we learn. There you go. There, then I don't have to. I want to say a special thanks to Sister Sima, who put so much energy and effort into this. I have to tell you, she is the most well-organized host I have met in all of my time traveling to different organizations. So I ask that Allah continues to open up the doors for Sister Sima and for all the programs here at Zaytuna. My Lord, indeed I am for whatever good you would send down upon me in need. I start out with this dua here because this is the place that, in many ways, my project of trying to understand the women figures in the Qur'an began. And it began with that sense of trying to locate myself as a Muslim woman in the unfolding of Islamic sacred history. And I would, coming to Islam as a convert Muslim in my early 20s, I was familiar with some of the figures and some of the characters from having had biblical studies in the past. But the Qur'an was the first time I felt an immediate kind of access, in a way, to these figures and to their emotional states, for instance. So reading the Qur'an, after having become familiar with certain figures from a biblical background, I could hear for the first time the speech of women figures, for instance. I could understand the relationship between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala working in the world to achieve certain aims and how the stories were playing out. So the way in which the Qur'an was telling the stories, not just from a narrative place, but interjecting the speech of Allah into these stories, just brought them alive in a whole new way. And as a new Muslim coming to Islam, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what my role as a woman in the world was. And so one of my first places to turn to the Qur'an was to rules about women and understanding the fiqh dimensions of being a woman. But gradually I found that it was actually in the stories that could illuminate the inner reality, the metaphysical reality, that relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that I couldn't quite get as strongly from the fiqh discourses. So this is one of the reasons why I turned to the women figures. And I found some surprising things, and some of those things I want to share with you today. And maybe you've already discovered some of these things for yourself, but for me, the process of coming to the Qur'an with this question about how to be a woman in the world, in relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in relationship to the other people in my life, this was really the impetus of the project. So one of the things that I found was that oftentimes when male figures are distressed in the Qur'an, it's actually women who come to their rescue. And so not only does this particular dua here represent sort of my state for being in a state of research, of that feeling of being impoverished and turning to the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for that sustenance, for that good, but those of you who are thinking about Surah Al-Qasas, can you think of the verse that immediately follows this verse? This is one of several places in the Qur'an where a male figure is in distress and where a female figure comes and the series of events unfolds such that the male figure is then put in a better state and station than when he was first, than where he was at first. And so, of course, this is one of the women in Midian who, and we don't know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not say, he just says that there was two sisters, and we don't know which one came walking to Musa. We later don't know which one encouraged her father to hire Musa. We don't know which one of them actually married Musa. But here we see this male figure in distress, in the middle of a desert, comes upon a watering hole, prays to God for refuge, for any source of refuge, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends a woman. We see this as well in other instances in the Qur'an. And these little pieces to me help tell a different story about the role of women, both for us as Muslims, but then as a way to speak back to a culture that often sees women in Islam as oppressed or burdened in a unique way. And so, in fact, in the Qur'an, we don't really see stories so much of men saving women who are in distress, which is kind of the Disney trope, right? We actually see the reverse. We see women coming to the aid of men. And Musa alayhi salam is actually one of the most needy men in the Qur'an. And we'll see this as the presentation unfolds. So I want to say a few words, since this is an academic institution and since it is in many ways itself a bridge between the liberal arts and classical Islamic learning. I'd like to say a few things about how I personally, coming out of a historically Jewish university, doing an area studies department, situated my own studies on the Qur'an. And I say this to all of you because many of you who are in the process of your studies might be thinking about how to bridge these two worlds of secular academia and traditional Islamic studies. I'll give you a few highlights of the research, and then I'll talk about some of my burning questions, which I already gave you a little bit of a hint about. And finally, we'll turn to a little bit of a quiz for you all, and that's the part in which I often take the most delight in, because having spent time with the Qur'an looking very specifically at a narrow topic and the minutiae of that topic, I always love to turn that out and to challenge people to continue to dig in the Qur'an and to continue to look at those subtleties and that minutiae. So we'll have a little game that we'll play at the end here. So coming out of an area studies department in an academy that largely has a secular focus, theology is oftentimes circumspect. And in that world where the possibilities for Quranic studies are, as you so rightfully alluded to, often constrained to discussing historical facts about the Qur'an. I knew I wanted to do something different with my project, and I knew I wanted to infuse in it a spirituality. So my studies were, for me, not just a profession, as I'm sure for many of you, this is a life path. This is a way to draw closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, inshallah. So I needed to figure out a way to do a type of research that would let me do the spiritual work of seeking ilm alongside of this professional foundation. And so what I decided to do for my particular project is to put aside questions of the authorship of the Qur'an. So for me, they're already settled. For people who come to the Qur'an as secular readers, those questions are already settled. So in my research, I would say just simply, the Qur'an says. And that was a way to avoid kind of delving into questions about the authorship of the Qur'an. So if you're thinking about how to write about the Qur'an for a secular audience, this is a good way to do it, because we have copies, we have and for the most part, the fact that there is a solid Qur'an that developed very early in Islamic history is not a point that even scholars who come from a more critical, skeptical point of view would dispute. And in terms of my own research, as I was researching the Qur'an, I'm experiencing it as that interaction with divine speech, but then I'm translating that into a way in which a secular reader could also approach. And what that means is that my work is often situated in a literary approach to the Qur'an. So there's some danger for a Muslim mind, perhaps, in slipping into a literary perspective, because for us, the characters in the Qur'an are not just characters, they represent a deeper reality. But this type of translation is, I think, what we need to do in order to bring Islamic learning, Islamic perspectives, and Islamic worldview to a wider audience. So I never really saw it as a compromise in the work. I saw it as a way of translating what the Qur'an has to say to an audience that might never have experienced it before. So of course, in a secular academy, you're also dealing with a lot of implicit biases against Muslims. And in particular, in the realm of women's studies, I was constantly navigating this line between being inspired by some ideas that come out of the women's movement, come out of a sense of developing women's agency and voices and telling women's history and women's perspectives. And I think many of this impetus has actually benefited in terms of scholarship on the Qur'an. There's many more women's voices who we now can tap into. Whereas the history of at least written scholarship on the Qur'an before the present moment, before maybe the 1950s, was largely completely male-dominated. And so I challenge you to think about a work of exegesis before the modern period that was composed by a woman. And this is not to minimize the role of our women scholars in transmitting the tradition and preserving knowledge in teaching, but it is to say that there has been historically this dearth of knowledge around women's written perspectives on the Qur'an. And so on the one hand, I'm trying in a way to say, what can I say about the Qur'an that has not been said before, which in some ways could potentially lead one to a position of real arrogance, or it seems like a dangerous place to start out. But I think in terms of a word of maybe advice and mentorship to those of you in the room, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives each of us unique curiosities and opens in each of us different doors of knowledge, and having access to the Qur'an through the medium of our own burning questions, as I'll talk about a little bit later, I think each of us can really bring a unique perspective, something about the Qur'an that has not been said exactly in the same way, or an insight. And over the course of this project, in my salat, I would regularly pray, Allah, give me like just tiny, tiny kernels of knowledge. Help me see things in the Qur'an. And I don't know if other people have seen some of these things before, but anytime I would discover something that I had not read in another book before, it would feel like a jewel, a gem, like a kind of a confirmation of the struggle to be in this field. So that said, I encourage each of you to approach the Qur'an seeking that sense of what can I discover in here, and seeking that relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through studying the Qur'an. And finally, it's just a methodological challenge that I came across, and that's how do you divide between what the Qur'an, the words of the actual Qur'an, and then this body of tafsir? And how much, if I'm focusing a project on the women figures, how deep into tafsir do I need to get? If I get too deep into tafsir, I might get lost in the details of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying in the Qur'an itself. And so for me, the way I approached this project was to limit it as much as possible just to what was in the Qur'an itself, and then where I needed to read slightly farther into the tafsir. But in my work, I don't discuss tafsir per se. I just use it as a mechanism for explicating the Qur'an. And so a lot of works on the Qur'an look to tafsir, and they're actually maybe more works studying tafsir than they are works studying the Qur'an. And so I wanted to, in my own work, try to put Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's the minutiae of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's words first and foremost, to dig into those words before turning to the words of our scholars. May God be pleased with them. So what I ended up doing was to look at the metaphysical concept of what womanhood was. And so womanhood is almost always in the Qur'an juxtapositioned against maleness in this concept of azwaj. And this concept is core, I think, because it links us as human beings to all of the rest of created things. And it shows us that although we are the haywan natiq, the rational beings, in so many ways we share this property of being azwaj with other created species. And in this, I think, is an important insight in that most of the differences that you find between women and men in fiqh relate to this concept of azwaj, and very specifically in the biological domain. So that you find most of the fiqh concepts relate back in some way to birth, suckling, the family structures, which is all tied to this concept, the biological concept of the way our species and many other species procreate. So I do a bit in the book on thinking about this concept of azwaj and the many ways that it manifests in the Qur'an. And then we move from the metaphysical into the embodied female. And here we deal with concepts of sexuality. One, the vast majority of Quranic stories, narratives by stories, involve sexuality in some way. And so this is a very prominent aspect of being a woman. And when I say sexuality, I mean the whole realm. I don't just mean in contemporary terms sort of a preference for a particular type of person. I mean everything that goes under the rubric of the experience of pregnancy, the experience of birth, the intimacy with a spouse before that. But we also find that in the Qur'an, interestingly, very few descriptions of women's physical features are mentioned. And even very few physical body parts of women are mentioned. So we have like the shins or the ankle of the Queen of Sheba. We have the rope around her neck of Abu Lahab's wife. We have the women who are cutting their hands. We have the eyes of the beings in paradise. But other than that, the Qur'an does not focus on the external features. Oh, we also have the mention of Qua'ib, which could be a reference to, a state of a prepubescent female, or a approaching female who's approaching puberty. But in any case, there's not a focus in the Qur'an on women's external forms, and this is quite striking. And there's a lot of focus, on the other hand, on women's internal states. And so we see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describing in very vivid terms the heart of the mother of Musa, the fuad, and then the qalb of the mother of Musa. We see the descriptions of Maryam in the moment when she's giving birth, and her words. I wish that I had died and become a forgotten thing before this. And so we see these moments. By the way, Maryam is she's literally bearing the burden of kalimatullah into the world. So she's, in that way, her agony in that moment of birth pangs and that delivery is, I think, in many ways akin to the agony that prophetic figures feel when they're trying to deliver this word into the world and facing all of the backlash. So Maryam too, as we know, when she delivered Allah's word into the world, she also faced the backlash. But interestingly, here on Maryam, and this is one feature in terms of female embodiment, and I'll get down here to female speech and God's speech to women. Maryam, in that moment when she's sort of pressed to come out before the crowd and they're taunting her, "Oh, sister of Harun, you're not your parents are not your mother is not a prostitute," etc., etc. She's actually sworn to an oath of silence in that moment, and in many ways it resembles structurally, thematically, the oath that Zachariah, or the not the oath, but the mandatory silence that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala imposed on Zachariah when he, alayhi salam, gets the word of his wife conceiving a child. But Maryam, in this moment where prophetic figures, she's delivered the word, the kalimatullah, into the world, and then it's the kalimatullah, it's Isa alayhi salam, ibn Maryam, that speaks. And so there's a really deep, I think, metaphysical reality that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is showing in that moment. And for me, that answered a lot of the questions around why are male figures mentioned as prophets, and what are women figures doing in terms of advancing the revelation into the world. And so for me, it's not that we should tell Islamic history based on a lineage of male prophets alone, but we can't ignore the role of women in also bringing this word to life in very specific ways. So that's female, on female embodiment. And by the way, pregnancy and birthing are, as you would probably estimate, very accentuated tropes in the Qur'an. And I don't just take that to mean that women's role is literally only in producing children, but that the metaphorical and the metaphysical idea of carrying something and then giving it life in the world, I think can tell us a lot of what is the unique capacities that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given to women specifically. On female kinship roles, I looked at mothers, sisters, daughters. I looked at mother-daughter relationships, father-daughter relationships, sibling relationships, and tried to map out the different patterns that we find in the Qur'an. So for instance, we don't find a corrupt mother interacting with her children in any of the Quranic stories. On the other hand, we see Ibrahim alayhi salam's father, telling him, "I will stone you." I mean, it's probably the worst thing that a parent could say to a child. But we don't see any mother figure. Now we see wife figures who we know also have children, but we don't see Imrat Lut or Imrat Nuh, the wife of Noah, or the wife of Lot. We don't see them at all interacting with their children. In fact, it's only their husbands who ever interact with their children. And in this section, it led me to think about the discourse that I often hear in Muslim communities, that women have the nurturing roles. And actually, part of what I looked at in reading the Qur'an was that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a lot of father-son, father-daughter interactions as well. And so if we think of nurturing merely as a biological function, we say that okay, women might do a bit more of that because they're carrying the burden, they're suckling potentially the baby, although that's not even a requirement for that specific woman who birthed the child to then also suckle. But if we look at the nurturing role, we actually see that men and women are doing this, both doing this nurturing role, because nurturing in my mind is connected to that tarbiyah, is connected to that child-parent relationship of guidance and dialogue. And again, that's not to minimize the role that women play in raising children, but that's to say that in terms of Quranic stories, we do not find an emphasis on mothers as the nurturers. In terms of female speech, we find 34 ayah that are specifically women speaking. In some of those ayah, women are speaking together with a male figure. So Adam, alayhi salam, never speaks in the Qur'an except with his wife. And when Allah speaks, oftentimes it's to the pair. Now there's a notable instance where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives words to Adam, alayhi salam. And that's one of the first stories, of course, in Al-Baqarah that we encounter. And interestingly, this giving of words, Adam receives the words, but then the pair say it in unison together, that formula of tawbah. The pair say it in unison together, which has always led me to wonder, what is this relationship between the transmission? So in my mind, we don't see a verse in the Qur'an that says, Adam then taught Hawa the words. We just find right away that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives Adam the words, and then the pair say the words in unison together. And it brings to my mind the idea that, and this is going to be controversial, I'll warn you, but that sometimes guidance to male figures is much more direct, and the guidance to female figures is sometimes much more intuitive. So for instance, when the heart of Musa, or the heart of Musa, the mother of Musa, receives revelation, when God inspires her heart, God just directly inspires her heart. The Qur'an doesn't say, and then we said to the mother of Musa, nurse him. It says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, we, revealed onto the heart of the mother of Musa. And so I think there's a deep, even though we see women speaking, we see in the Queen of Sheba, who has quantitatively some of the most, she's the most loquacious figure in the Qur'an, alongside Imrat Aziz Misr, and followed by Maryam, alayhi salam. Even though we see that women do speak, and women speak really frequently to God, but in terms of God's speech to women, it's much less frequent in the Qur'an. But we don't necessarily have to read that as saying, oh, God speaks less frequently to women's hearts or something like this. We could say there is a qualitative, perhaps, difference in the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala interacts with these prophetic figures that are receiving speech and the way in which the pious women receive this revelation. And finally, women in sacred history. I would challenge you to kind of list in your mind all of the women figures that you can think of in the Qur'an. And I wonder, if we were in a workshop, we might actually do this, but I wonder if as you were working on your list, if what would come to mind would be the parents of Sulaiman alayhi salam. Would the parents of Joseph, of Yusuf alayhi salam, come to mind? Would the ahl of Saleh alayhi salam come to mind? Would the ahl of Musa, the family of Musa, come to mind? But yet we see, what is Musa alayhi salam doing when he encounters the voice of Allah in Revelation? He's going to search out something for his family. So we find when we look closer that women are there. They're always around these prophetic figures. So we look at Musa, Isa alayhi salam, all of the major prophet figures in the Qur'an, and most of the minor, not all of them, I'm talking about minor of being the Nabi versus the Rasul. All of the Rasul have women figures, and some of them multiple women figures. And most of the Nabi also have families mentioned or specific women figures mentioned. So we find that women are there, even if they're not always the focus of our narratives in terms of the way we as Muslims relate our stories. So part of the reason that I came to Islam was because of traditions like this one, that I saw this deep respect for women in the life of the Prophet ﷺ, and then continuing on into major figures in our tradition. And at the same time, I found that if I would sit in halaqas and if I would hear khutbahs, I wouldn't necessarily hear as much the stories of women. Like I would actually have to go out searching for those. They wouldn't just kind of come to me. And so then I started asking as a kind of a fairly new Muslim, these questions that for me became really important. And so when I would hear the genealogies of the male prophets, I would always wonder, where are the females in this story? And again, this question about how can a woman achieve proximity to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? I've often heard, and Asharis in the room will confirm this, that kind of prophets have the highest station. And I wonder if is that a Quranic principle? Is that a principle that's drawn from the hadith? Because I think if we say that prophets have the highest station, we're sort of overlooking the fact that you have figures like Maryam, like other figures in our tradition who are doing really amazing, important, critical things to advance the unfolding of history. And so I think there's a way, and this is a point in which I would invite a lot of dialogue from those of you in the room who have a stake in this issue as well, about if we give that message over and over and over, what does that do to the women in our community who are trying to find role models and trying to find exemplars? And is there a better way to talk about the figures without necessarily always just focusing on the prophetic figures who happen to be, at least in the ones named in the Qur'an, all men? And I speak this as a point of how do we reach the hearts of young women who are trying to locate themselves vis-a-vis Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and vis-a-vis the possibility of accessing knowledge and understanding revelation. So one burning question that I had for a very long time is, why is Maryam alayhi salam the only woman mentioned by a personal name? And does that mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is on personal terms with, Khalilullah, Ibrahim, and on personal terms speaking with Musa, alayhi salam? And what does that say about the ability, again, of women to be in this intimate type of relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And then again, the questions that I started to raise in the beginning about women's biological functions. And is a woman her major worth in kind of how many children she can put in the world? And where does this idea come from in our social milieu as Muslims? And if we look at the Qur'an, how much is the biological roles of women stressed in terms of the spiritual development of women? And then finally, the question that I brought to you before about that the nurturing nature, and can we say that women have a very specific nature and men have a very specific nature? And is that concept, is that something we've brought to the Qur'an culturally, or is that something that we can derive from the actual ayat of the Qur'an? So those are my burning questions. Now I have a few questions for you all. So who is the first person, or the first individual woman mentioned in the order of the Tanzil, so the order of the revelatory order of the Qur'an? Who is the first individual woman figure mentioned? Take a guess? So in my understanding, and again, I'm consulting books here on the revelatory order of the Qur'an, which are not perfect. They're the work of our scholars trying to piece together the revelatory order, but it looks like it's actually the wife of Abu Lahab. Isn't it? The Qur'an is this book of guidance, but it's also the book of warning, right? And so the first Muslim, or the first figure, definitely not Muslim, the first figure that comes in terms of representing women is the wife of Abu Lahab. And then it improves from there. So we have the wife of Abu Lahab, and then how many other Quranic figures are explicitly damned who are women? Yes, the wife of Lut and the wife of Nuh. Interestingly, the verse in Surah At-Tahrim, at the end of Surah At-Tahrim, that says, "It was said unto them, Maqila," it was said, "Enter the fire." That doesn't come, Surah At-Tahrim is nearly at the end of the Tanzili order, right? So in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's wisdom, He's told us at the beginning and at the end, kind of the first warning and the last warning, do not be like these figures. The first figure has a husband who's also damned, and she's facilitating his damnation in the fire. And then the last two women are examples of women who have prophetic husbands and who still don't heed the warning. Now, so who is the first individual woman mentioned in the Mus'haf? Yeah, it would be the Azwaj, the Zawj of Adam, alayhi salam. And we find that she's the first woman in sacred history. And when I say sacred history, I mean the kind of unraveling of the way that in which the Qur'an tells the genealogy of prophetic families. So she's the first individual mentioned, and she's the first in the Mus'haf as well. We also find that she is, of course, never mentioned by a personal name. And so in my research, in an effort to kind of confine myself to what the Qur'an says, I always say the spouse of Adam. She's never called Imrat. We never see Imrat Adam. Have you ever heard that phrase before, Imrat Adam? It's just not in the Qur'an. So there's a very interesting dynamic when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses azwaj to refer to a wife-spouse figure. We see that azwaj is used for figures that have let me say, we see azwaj and nabi, for instance. And it's used in that context where there's a parity between the spouses. And so even the use of azwaj, we can infer that they're zawj. They're literally, in a dictionary definition, one of a pair. And so we find that imrat is often used when there's a difference in spiritual state or station between the two parties. But then we have, and it could go either way in terms of the woman having a higher state than the male figure, or the other way. But we find that zawj, that word zawj, has a very particular meaning in the Qur'an. So how many Temptress figures are there? So if we look at like world literature, women are always cast as the Temptress figure, right? So we have one Quranic Temptress figure. And of course, she is flawed in her relationship to Yusuf, of course. She's in this puts him in this compromised sexual situation where he says, Ma'adallah, God forbid, and he seeks refuge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in the Quran, we find a remarkable balance. We find that we have this female figure who is this temptress, but then we also find a female figure who is in her private chambers, and a male figure comes and she says, I seek refuge from the compassionate if you are among the pious, right? So we see Maryam says the exact same thing that Yusuf says to the wife of the Egyptian viceroy. So we see that even in terms of responding to a potential threat of a compromised sexual situation, we see that men and women in the Quran respond very similarly. The wife of the Egyptian viceroy, the vizier, we also see in her a figure who eventually repents, right? I wouldn't call it repentance. So let's call it apologizes, or maybe not even apologizes, admits she's wrong. So we see this movement, her heart begins to move. She admits the truth, and granted she's kind of under pressure to do so, it's not of her own free volition. But in this woman figure we see a person in process. And I oftentimes think that it's sometimes easier as ordinary Muslims to relate to a person in process that has a bunch of flaws than it is to relate to a figure who is raised in a temple by prophets and who is chosen by God to fulfill this marvelous function. And so even when we have a temptress figure, the way that she's presented, she begins to redeem herself. We never hear her say, I'm sorry, Yusuf. Ya Yusuf, I messed up. We never hear her say, Ya Rabb, forgive me for my sins. We never hear that. But at least we hear the very beginning of her process of turning. By the way, I think, so the word Zulaykha never comes in the Quran, but if you look it up by its root in an Arabic dictionary, you find all kinds of wonderful meanings that actually tie quite well to her role in the story. Okay, so who is the only major woman figure in the Quran who has no kinship relations? We have lots of mother figures, we have daughter figures, sister figures. Who is the only figure who doesn't have any kinship relations mentioned? Yeah, exactly. And so when I looked at Bilqis, who's also obviously not called Bilqis in the Quran, but is just referred to as the Queen of Sheba, I noticed that before the story of Bilqis, you have this story of the little ants, right? And when you read the story of the ants, at least I read it this way, I wondered, what does this have in any way to do with the story that follows? And as is true with many of the stories in the Quran, you have to look very, very closely, and you have to actually think quite deeply to begin to discern some of the connections. So what do we know about ant colonies? in relationship to the sexual, let's call it sexual identity of the leader of the ant colony. Exactly. So you actually have a queen ant. And what else do we know about ants? That they're incredibly territorial, that they have these, networks. And so in this story where you see the queen ant, the forces of Suleiman are lined up. He's ready to go to battle. By the way, that the word yuwaza'un, that word means to marshal in ranks. And it also means to inspire. And so when the ant figure, says to her colony, or I think it would be a her. The Qur'an just says the ant, but we'll call it a her ant. When perhaps this queen ant figure gives the order for her colony to take refuge, Suleiman hears her words and is inspired, right? And so that same word, his forces were all marshaled, but then he hears the word of the ant, and then he prays, Rabb, my Lord, inspire me to give thanks. So he asks for shukr. And in that moment, you see a queen figure teaching Suleiman kind of a lesson, a reminder, giving him a reminder. And then in the story that follows, you see Suleiman giving a queen figure a reminder. In a way, that's one way you can describe the story. And so even in this little story, you see a type of balancing of gender norms. And also you see that the story of this conquest of Suleiman marching his troops out, the very fact that he's inspired to pray for what? What does he pray for? Inspire me to give thanks, to pray for my parents, and on and on and on. This ant figure reminds him of his mother and father figure, of all things. And it puts the story into the spiritual, it takes it off the battlefield and puts it immediately into the field of morality and ethics. And that's the same transition that the queen later makes when she recognizes she was oriented towards her physical throne, but then she becomes, by the end, oriented to the throne of Allah, subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so she says, Rabbi inni zalamtu nafsi, and I submit, with Suleiman to the Lord of the worlds. Who else says, my Lord, surely I have wronged myself? Yunus says it, Musa says it. So in using this very phrase, she's using a formula that prophetic figures use throughout the Qur'an to do the tawbah. And no one taught her this phrase, right? It's from her inner being that she knows to say, Inni zalamtu nafsi. So here, for instance, by the way, in the very, Surah An-Naml is what, 27 in the order? It's in the next surah that Musa alayhi salam says, Inni zalamtu nafsi. So taking this back to kind of the study of the Qur'an, one of the challenges and the opportunities I think that we have is how to do academic secular studies of the Qur'an in the way that I described in the beginning, while also trying to impart these deep lessons. And it happens that literary studies is a great mechanism for doing that, because you can, discuss the inner evolution of a character, for instance, in a literary framework. But that literary framework also opens up the doors for us as Muslims to talk about the spiritual development. And if you're writing for an explicitly Muslim audience, you could write in explicit terms about what the implications of this story have for us today. So for me, one of the lessons that I take very strongly out of the story of the Queen of Sheba is to remember always, if I'm oriented towards physical things and material realities and power and control and all of these things, that I'm not really focusing on maybe what is the bigger priority of life. So literary studies of the Qur'an lets us do that kind of the tarbiyah approach to what the Quranic stories are telling us. How am I doing on time? Okay? One of the remarkable features of the Qur'an is that we do, as I mentioned in the beginning, get to access the words of the female figures in their own words. And I won't delve into this too much, but I did want to just point out that the very last words, let's zoom in here a little bit, the very last words, this is not the Arabic is different than the English here. The very last words that a female figure speaks in the Qur'an, so the very last ayah that contains, like, call it, she said, is the wife of Pharaoh, and she asks for a house near God in the garden and deliverance from Pharaoh and his deeds and deliverance from the wrongdoing people. So she's the very first woman, or the very last woman with a line of speech in the Qur'an. And what is she asking for? She's asking for nearness to Allah. The second, the house, she's asking for, sakina, perhaps, the peace that comes with having a residence next to Allah. And then she's asking for an improvement in her an escape from her domestic situation. And not just her domestic situation, but all of the people who are around her who are enabling that poor domestic situation to happen. So the very last ayah of speech that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us in the Qur'an is addressing one of the issues that plagues humankind generally and plagues our ummah specifically. And that's this issue of the house not being a place of sakina. The very first verse that a female speaks in the Qur'an is actually the zawj of Adam, and she's doing this tawbah, the sense of tawbah, and I don't want to be polemical, but I do want to make this point. So, in the way that the Qur'an presents the story, we see that it is a very shared culpability, which is different from how the story had been presented before the time of the Qur'an. And in the fact that it's a shared culpability, the very first verses of female speech in the Mus'haf are also, in a way, refuting this idea that women are somehow the source of evil in the world. Okay, so you have, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala starts off with a woman, showing this act of tawbah with her husband, simultaneously, in unison, saying this tawbah formula. And in my mind, that serves as to undermine the myth that women are uniquely impure, have a unique capacity to error, are dangerous to be around because they lead you to error, etc. So on both ends of the Mus'haf, and kind of in all of these places in between, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is turning over previous conceptions of women and is instructing the ummah for how to have more of a correct view of the capacity for a woman to have spiritual realization. I also wanted to highlight it. Sorry, I didn't put an English translation, but this is the verse where the wife of Imran, who, by the way, we never see Imran, we just see his wife. So we just see the wife of Imran. So this is one of the unique instances where we just see the female figure, and no, the husband is kind of implicitly mentioned, but is just somewhere in the background. But we see the wife of Imran asking, devoting her child to the service of the temple. And this is one of many verses where women are actively seeking that proximity to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and are doing pious deeds of drawing nearer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, I promised you we'd get back to this. So just kind of count in your mind how many women figures are there surrounding Musa. And this is why I said at the beginning of all of the figures in the Qur'an, he is kind of the most needy of support from women. Okay, so let's just work backwards. I talked in the beginning about the sister of the two sisters in Median, right? His eventual wife who gets him a job, marries him, lands him in a good family situation. By the way, we have in Zulaykha, as I mentioned, this figure of a temptress who puts a man in a compromised situation and is going about the whole relations thing in a very bad way. But here you have an example of a woman figure who recognizes the characteristics of Musa as being qawi, as being amin, and encourages her father to hire him. So women looking for a spouse, find a good business partner for your father. I'm just joking. But this is one of the things that I tell to young women who ask me about this whole process of finding a spouse, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us in the Qur'an a story of a woman who kind of sets things in motion, and then her father makes this arrangement that Musa works and marries one of the sisters. Ooh. Okay, so we have, we're counting, so we have 2 there. Musa has a foster mom, right, who gets him not killed. Okay, so the first 2 women save him from wandering in a desert. Here's a woman who gets him not killed. We're up to 3. Ooh, I think I missed a slide here. Did it? Okay, I think I forgot to just connect it. So anyway, we have then his sister figure who saves him from being kind of lost forever in the palace of Pharaoh. Okay, we're up to 4. Then we have the Ahl of Pharaoh who pull him from the river, and Ahl usually means family unit, so we can assume that there's some women doing that too. Okay, we're up to 5. And then, so they save him from drowning in a river. And then we have 6, who's his mother figure, who saves him from being killed by the forces of Pharaoh. So he has 6 different women figures who are all at various junctures in his life saving him. And I had never, before I kind of reconstructed the story that way for myself, I had never kind of seen the role of all of these women. And I had only seen it in terms of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala narrates, a big surah focused on the life of Musa. Why, where are the women in all of that? And then I realized that, the women are at every single juncture of that particular story. Finally, let's look at this idea of matriarchs, which is quite phenomenal in the Qur'an, actually. So we're oftentimes taught thinking about the genealogy in terms of Ibrahim and Yaqub Ibrahim and Ishaq and Ishmael and Yaqub and focusing, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have shower peace and blessings upon them and their families. And at the same time, we also have God choosing, in this particular verse, you see, the house of Abraham. So Al, Alif Lam, the house of Abraham. And so why say it's not just Ibrahim, right? Alayhi salam. It's the house. So that concept of chosenness of the house. And we see as well the wife of Ibrahim, Sarah, who's not mentioned in the Quran as Sarah, but is known to us as Sarah. We see her addressed directly by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as Ahl al-Bayt. Okay, who else do we see as Ahl al-Bayt? Right? The Azwaj al-Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And think about our prayers, asking peace and blessings upon, Ibrahim and the family of Ibrahim and Muhammad and Sayyidina Muhammad. So even in the Quran, in terms of calling Sarah and the Ahl of the house, we see that there's a parallel that the Quran says between calling the family of the Prophet. And you also see the house of Imran. Now remember what I said, Imran's nowhere really in the picture. Who is the house of Imran that's represented in the Quran? Let's zoom in here. So these names are taken from tafsir works. But the house of Imran, it's a matriarchal lineage. And who in the Qur'an do we see both getting birth and then birthing? We see Maryam, alayhi salam. So I often thought about the fact that we see patriarchs, right? But the Qur'an actually also gives us grandmother figures. Okay, in the mother of Maryam, we have a grandmother figure. So we have Jesus' grandmother in the Qur'an, okay? I mean, that's pretty special. And then also Sarah, oftentimes we just think of her as the wife of Abraham and of Ibrahim alayhi salam, and then the mother of Ismail and Ishaq. But she's also the grandmother of Yaqub, right? And then what else? She's a great-grandmother figure. We have a great-grandmother figure in the Qur'an, right? And she's explicitly, I don't have the verse in front of me, but she's explicitly given news of this, it's not Ishaq. Ishaq. Okay, specifically given news of Ishaq, and after Ishaq, Yaqub, right? So she's even, the Qur'an is not just giving her news of a one miraculous birth, but then she's getting this news that she's also going to be a grandmother, by the way. So that's just what I drew from this was that there's a matriarchy in the Qur'an as well. And that I wasn't ever taught that, but that when I went to the Qur'an looking for it, it did emerge. Okay, so now I've shared a lot, and now I want to play a little bit of a game for you. Some of these questions, if you have a notepad, that's fine, you can write them down. If you're just doing it in your head, that's great. So the challenge of this game is some of these questions are very hard, and some of them are easy. And in my experience, a lot of times we as Muslims read the Qur'an just kind of linearly, and there's immense benefit, obviously, in that going juz by juz by juz. But part of the delight for me personally is kind of looking at all of these different sections of the Qur'an and seeing how they relate to one another in very subtle ways. And so this game is kind of geared to helping us do that. So now if you think of the figures, if they come to you really quickly, I challenge you also to kind of try to do the verse ID and then to try to review that verse in your mind as well as a kind of reviewing. Don't worry, I'm not collecting your papers. Nobody's going to fail. I work in a high school, and when I give an assignment to ask them to think about something, they literally, without fail, ask me, how long do you want us to think about this? So I have to say, think about it for 20 minutes. So which female figures interact with angels? Which women are explicitly damned? We talked a little bit about this one. And which woman says Bismillah in the name of God, the Compassionate, the Merciful? Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. By the way, some scholars say that this is like the missing Bismillah that's not on Surah At-Tawbah. But even the fact that here you have a woman, she's not even Muslim in the sense that her heart has not yet gone through that process of submission. But what she receives this noble letter, she recognizes it, she reads it out loud. So the speech, she's literally saying Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim in the Qur'an, the only Quranic figure to do that, which is an interesting aspect of her figure. And then she recognizes, what does she say? It's a noble letter. Kareem, isn't it? Is it Kareem? Am I remembering that right? So here it shows that she intuitively has knowledge that this letter is a noble letter. So I gave away that one, obviously. We talked about figures being damned. So there's plenty of Quranic figures that interact with angels, right? Lots of them. And so did you shout out your answer? Yeah, of course. And? Good, yeah. Maryam and Sarah alayhi salam. So which woman explicitly received direct revelation from God? Musa, may God be pleased with her. Which three women got pregnant in unusual circumstances? Maryam and Sarah, and then the Imrat Zachariah, right? Zachariah. May God be pleased with them all. Okay, so this one's a very easy one. I wanted to give people encouragement if they were not as learned as you all are, mashallah. By the way, there's one that gets a little bit harder after this, so brace yourselves. Okay, so which female figures get married in the course of Quranic stories? We talked about the wife of Musa. Who else? We just have it in one ayah, one passing ayah. It's in Surah Al-Ahzab. Yes. Interestingly, too, that verse is the direct middle verse of Surah Al-Ahzab. And in Surah Al-Ahzab and Surah Al-Imran, in my work, I outline a lot of structural parallels between those two. And in Surah Al-Ahzab, that particular verse is the 37th verse, the 37th ayah. And in that verse, you see a woman figure coming under the care of a prophetic figure. She marries Zainab bin Jahsh, may God be pleased with her, marries the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In Surah Al-Imran, in the 37th verse, is when Maryam goes under the care of Zachariah. So you have another instance where a woman figure is going under the care. And this is just one example of the parallels between the two. There are many. And by the way, they're in the Tanzili order, like in the revelatory order, the surahs are actually close together, so that the correspondences were probably not lost on the early Muslim community. Okay, so which sisters does the Quran mention? So obviously the sisters in Madian and the sister of Musa. By the way, those are both like supportive sisters, right? How many corrupt sister figures do we have in the Quran? None, right? There are no corrupt sisters in the Quran. Some of you are like, that's not true to my experience. But how many corrupt brother figures do we have? Yusuf has a whole bunch, right? And we also see that, for instance, there's no corrupt girl figures, even though we have girl figures in the Quran, but there is a corrupt boy figure, right? El-Khidr is sent to support the parents of this corrupt boy figure by taking care of that situation. Okay, so, all right, how many women are described as harsh or otherwise incompetent mothers? So we do have in a way, the wife of the vizier is the foster mother of Yusuf, right? So we do she's not a very good foster mother figure at all. But other than that, we don't see, as I mentioned at the outset, any women who are explicitly in the course of a Quranic narrative being harsh against being harsh against the children in their care. Okay, so again, no jealous or vengeful sister figures. All right, 2 mother-daughter pairs. Yeah, Musa and the mother of Musa and Musa's sister, and then I'm blanking here. Oh, of course. Maryam and her mother, alayhi salam. So which 2 fathers mention their daughters? There's one really obvious one and one subtle one. I'm going to let you think about that for a sec. So we have the relationship that we talked about with the father of the sisters in Midian, right? And then we also have Lut, who mentions his daughter figures. Now, what other daughter figures are mentioned in relationship to a father figure? In one verse in Surah Ahzab, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, tell, and then goes on for a list of the women figures of your family, and includes Banatik. Yeah. Okay, so which woman gets fooled and realizes her mistake? The Queen of Sheba. All right, this one's a hard one. I told you I would get some hard ones on here. So what are some aristocratic female figures that are alluded to or mentioned? So Zainab bin Jahsh, may God be pleased with her, radiyallahu anha, came from the Qurayshi aristocracy. Who else? The Queen of Sheba, obviously. Who else? Yeah, good. The wife of Pharaoh. Who else? Was Sarah? And it could be. It could be. And there's narrations that locate her in a lineage, not so much in the course of the stories that we see in the Qur'an, but maybe in her background. Exactly. And I just point this out to say that there are a lot of women figures in the Qur'an who hold these stations of kind of political power and authority in terms of their polity. But then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala balances that out with figures like Hajar, right? Who comes in terms of where she is in Ibrahim's, alayhi salam, Sayyidina Ibrahim's household, comes in as not an aristocratic figure, although we have narrations that she does indeed come from a noble lineage. All right, so which female figures physically hurt themselves? Yes. Yeah. So we said this, which woman is birthed and gives birth? That's Maryam, alayhi salam. So a girl figure that's clever under pressure? Yeah. I really like teaching that story to young women. It makes it, if you're involved in teaching like a Sunday school or something, that story connects with kids' hearts really well. How many women speak, this is a hard one, I told you they'd get hard. How many women speak prayers to God? So in my list, I came up with 4. So we talked about Hawa, Zawju Adam. We talked about the Queen of Sheba, right? It says, Rabbi inni zalamtu nafsi. We saw the ayat of Asya, right? Asking for the sakina, the place of refuge and safety. And then the wife of Imran, who prays for the woman prays for the child in her belly to be dedicated to the Lord. Now, this one stumps people quite frequently, and we didn't talk about it at all today. So we know Surah Maryam. That's an obvious answer to the last question, the 19th question. What other 2 women have a surah named in their honor? Good. And Mujaddala and Mumtahana. So, alhamdulillah, you all pass with flying colors. MashaAllah, Zaytuna is doing a wonderful job. You've passed my Women in the Qur'an course with flying colors. And I just in terms of wrapping up and turning this back over to my wonderful hosts, I want to say that for me, the process of approaching the Qur'an in this way with what I want to call a burning question is something that I want to pass on and encourage people to do. Oftentimes I find people lamenting that they don't have a teacher and they need a teacher, and it's so hard to find a teacher. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us many wonderful people as teachers, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has also given us His speech directly. So that's a pretty good teacher if you need one. So maybe if you have a practice of of simply like reading ayah for ayah. That's wonderful, keep doing that. But for me, one thing that's been really powerful in my own spiritual development has been coming to the Qur'an with those existential questions. And so I encourage you to dig down deep and figure out what are your deep existential questions, and then take it to the Qur'an and then see how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala inshallah speaks to your heart through these deep questions. So jazakumullahu khairan for listening so intently, and I want to thank again my gracious host, and also just say if there's anything that I said that was inaccurate, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive me, and may He continue to increase all of us in ilm. وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم آمين.
Dr. Celene, thank you so much for this illuminating speech. It was deep, and we all learned so much tonight. And now it's up to the audiences. You have Mike on your right and on my right. And please come and ask the questions, and Zaytuna students will get the preference. Thank you.
Bismillah. If anyone has a question, please go ahead and step forward and use the mic on your front left.
Assalamu alaikum again. This might be kind of a silly question, but if Maryam is the only one mentioned by name in the Qur'an, how do we know the names of all these other figures?
Yeah, that's not a silly question at all. So sometimes tafsir will contain names of specific figures, but oftentimes, for instance, the mother of Musa, if you go searching for the name of the mother of Musa in the Quran, you'll end up with a list of about 20 options. And so on the one hand, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't tell us the name directly, it's probably not of great importance to our spiritual. I'm going to sit over here so I can see you all a bit better. So it's, on the other hand, there is a kind of intimacy in knowing someone's name. And so some of these names are drawn from Hebrew traditions, for instance. Others are part of oral history that then come into tafsir. But in terms of figuring out what was the actual name, a lot of times we don't have very good sources to rely on.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for this. This is, mashallah, great. It's really kind of whetting the appetite to see your book when it actually comes out. Mashallah, I think there's going to be a lot to read there. I guess my question is more methodological in terms of how you went about studying the Qur'an to look for this. Can you give us a sense of what your process was, what methods you used to employ that? Did you just open page one and start going through, or or could you speak a little bit about your process and your research there? Thanks.
Thank you. I approached it differently in that I, from the very beginning, said, basically, Ya Allah, this is like between you and me kind of thing. Like this is my own spiritual journey. And so instead of turning right away to the tafsir, I actually just did sort of a line by line, starting with the Fatiha and trying to go through like this, identifying all of these and flagging these verses that later on then I wanted to dig into deeper. And in that way it was kind of a direct process of discovery for me. And I knew that if I turned right away to the tafsir, I'd get muddled kind of in all of these details of, and where is the story taking place and when is the story taking place, and what color was the camel, or this kind of detail that you sometimes get with tafsir works. And so that, to me, anytime I was kind of wandering too far perhaps into these kind of minutiae. I was always trying to take it back to the Qur'an itself, and I joke that the dictionaries kind of were my best friends for 5 years, and me and Edward William Lane had a weekend appointment every weekend to get this is the author of the one of the modern dictionaries that I find one of the most easy to use. So in terms of from a research perspective, I did what was easy for me, and then dug deeper as the questions came up, because I knew if I was digging deep to begin with, I might get lost in kind of what was my question, what is my purpose. And so to me it was always also, I would write and then pray, and then write and then pray, and then write and then pray. And oftentimes in the prayer, astaghfirullah, that things come to your mind in the prayer, but oftentimes in the prayer these little kernels of insight would then come. So I felt like it was very much this process, and I would ask Allah to support the research at every single state. And for all of you who are in that process of doing research, that's, I think, one of the beauties of being Muslim doing research in Islamic studies, that you can rely, inshallah, and may Allah correct all the mistakes that I probably have in the book, but you can use the research as a spiritual quest.
Assalamu alaikum, jazakumullah khair. That was really enlightening. Did you at all consider the minority perspective, like I believe Al-Qurtubi, that women were prophets, is one question. And the second is, you didn't mention Hajar, which to my memory, she's not actually mentioned in the Quran, it's more in the Hadith, and yet she plays such a pivotal role in our sa'i and Hajj and everything.
Yeah, so again on that question of women being prophets or not, I went with what was explicitly, so I just looked at where in the Quran, who does the Quran explicitly describe as Rasul, Nabi? And this is the way I avoided kind of going off in a lot of different directions, is by just simply saying, from what I can answer based on just the Quran alone. And a lot of places in my footnotes I say, based on the Quran alone, but I'm not, and I also say I'm not advocating a reading for the Quran alone, but my particular contribution is this. And in terms of just advice to younger scholars in the room, oftentimes you have to do that in your research, because your research will take you in a lot of different directions, and then you have to constantly say, wait, my contribution is this. And someone else can maybe do this, or I'll get to this in the next project, but that sense of narrowing. And so also I don't have much information on Hajar, may God be pleased with her, radiyallahu anha, for that very point that aside from the mention of the rituals of Safa and Marwa, and aside from the mention of Ibrahim settling his progeny in a sacred valley, there is not a robust Quranic story that deals explicitly with her struggle. We get that from other sources. Yeah.
Thank you so much, first, again. I noticed that a lot of the Quranic prototypes for males that were discussed in a positive light were mostly relating to prophets, who all had somewhat of a similar role. They all had a message to bring. And so for men to follow, it's a little bit more straightforward, whereas as we've gone through, all the women prototypes seem to have radically different roles, those presented in a positive light. So I was wondering if you, in your research, have found one archetype or prototype to be more of a universal role model than any other for women specifically. Yeah, that's basically my question.
Yeah. Yep, right there.
Yeah, I found that in terms of the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described the women, that there was not any qualitative difference between the characteristics and the qualities that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ascribed to women figures as there were to male figures, other than Nabi and those exact, like Nabi and Rasul. But in terms of the qualities, there wasn't qualities that were like specifically feminine qualities and qualities that were specifically masculine qualities. Really, I didn't find a kind of clear division like that. And I also didn't find necessarily the same qualities always coming up for women either. It was just this, which might be akin to how we see the world in terms of the personality traits that we inhabit. I don't necessarily think that personality traits are gendered in that specific way. People disagree with me on that, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaches us the Asma Allah al-Husna, and then some of those are the mutashabihat. And to my mind and in my reading, men and women exhibit these qualities. And so I didn't find an archetypal pious woman figure. And you see figures all along the spectrum of piety as well. So we do see corrupt women, we see women in process. So we see Zulaykha, who started the process of doing tawbah but didn't really complete it in terms of what's presented in the Qur'an. Then we have the Queen of Sheba, who does the whole process of tawbah. And then we have figures who are exemplary for the Muslim community, who the wives of the Prophet ﷺ, two of them are obviously in Surah At-Tahrim, chided by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we see pious women making mistakes. We see like an impious woman making big mistakes and almost doing tawbah, and then we see also really pious women making a tiny mistake and then being told to do tawbah. So there's this really beautiful balance, and I kept finding, if there's one thing that I kept finding balance. I found balance between pious and impious, and old and young, and male and female, and everywhere there was this really pronounced balance. Would that be all the questions?
There's another question coming from the back.
Okay.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you as well for your talk. I was wondering if you could give like a few comments on motherhood, and if you had any kind of like recommendations of reading or specific examples to look at about sort of the qualities to bring to motherhood or wifehood that are in the Qur'an. Thank you.
That's wonderful. So did you ask about wifehood as well at the end, or just okay?
Kind of both.
Yeah. Almost every single story that involves either a mother or a wife, I think, has some things and multiple things, right, to teach us about how to be women or spouses, how to engage. And so there wasn't kind of one lesson that kept coming up. There was like each set of stories had its own sort of lessons to impart. And I think in that way, there's a lot of instruction in there, and we get different things from different stories in terms of the application. But the recurring message, which is not just about mother figures or wife figures, is always going back to that, surrender to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, do the tawbah, these very basic messages that don't necessarily relate to motherhood specifically or being a wife specifically. And this is another sort of remarkable aspect of the Qur'an that I found, was that if you had a set of characteristics, so in Surah At-Tahrim, for instance, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the two wives who have given the Prophet somewhat of a headache with their chatter how to repent, otherwise they will be replaced. And then there's a long list of qualities that they could be replaced by, and in that same list, that list is almost an exact parallel of in Surah Al-Ahzab, you have a list, the believing women and the believing men and the believing women and so forth. And so there are a lot of parallels between that list, which you can infer that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is describing this hypothetical wife for the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it's actually the characteristics that in another place Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes as both men and women possessing. And even virtues like chastity, for instance, which culturally speaking in Muslim communities, kind of the burden falls on women. If you look at the Qur'an, it's not addressed like in a very specific way to women, except for one small tiny detail that I found so interesting. Women and men alike are told to guard the, protect, hifz al-furuj, right? So women and men are told to do this. Women alone are taught to fortify. And so women actually do take an extra step. But interestingly, it's literally the same word that is like a fortress, coming from the same root. And so women are told to fortify. And for me, that's this sense of protection from, literally, if you think of a fortress, it's protection from invading forces, enemy forces or something. And so there is, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does give this slight instruction to women to fortify, and which I found notable.
Assalamu alaikum and jazakallahu khairan. So it seems like to me there's still a greater emphasis on women in relation to men in the Islamic tradition, especially with the four greatest women. Maryam alayhi salam is the mother of Isa alayhi salam, and Khadija radiallahu anha is the wife of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Fatima radiallahu anha is the daughter of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then even Asiya, she's the wife of Pharaoh. So my question is kind of, how do you see women, especially these great women, separate from their relationship to men?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's actually not a lot of single women in the Qur'an, right? You have Bilqis, you have the Queen of Sheba, but in general, even with male figures, you find the same thing, that there's not a lot of single male figures, that most of them, Yusuf stands out as one example of a prophet who you don't see at any point in a relationship with a specific woman figure. I mean in a marital relationship with a specific woman figure. And even a character, a figure, a personality like Luqman, for instance, a male figure mentioned who's not a prophet but who is wise, is mentioned with his son. So if he has a son, he's going to have a wife, right, at some point. So the same is true, that one of the things that was very pronounced for me is this emphasis all throughout on family relations, and even in such subtle ways. So we have the instruction, right, to testify against justice, whether it be a rich person or a poor person, or if it be one of your relatives, or if it be against yourself, etc. You even have in the story of Zulaykha, who is it that testifies and says, gives the advice, well, just look at the shirt, look at the physical evidence. It's what? A witness from her family. And so to me, these subtleties about just family dynamics in general permeate Quranic stories. With the exception of the story of Bilqis, for instance, that's the only one that does not, in some way, in terms of the women figures, revolve around some sort of family dilemma, family situation. And if we think about our lives, we all have families. We couldn't get here without a family. So I think this is just kind of a mirroring of the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has designed the world. What was the second part of your question?
How do you break away from seeing women in relation to men?
Yeah. I think in Quranic stories you see women with agency. So this is a big word in feminist thought, and you see it in the Quran. So for instance, you see a woman who chooses to be Muslim, at great peril, even when that's against the wishes of her husband. You see the inverse, you see women who are not Muslim even when they're getting advice from their husbands to be Muslim. So if for instance, even in Musa, may God be pleased with her, I mean, where's Abu Musa in all of this? You don't see Abu Musa, right? So you see a woman here making a life or death decision. There's nowhere, it's not like she received the revelation to her heart and then she said, yeah, Abu Musa, what do you think? So I'm not saying that we shouldn't consult our partners or anything. Like, that's not what I'm saying. But I'm just saying that you see women taking major decisions, for good and for bad, on their own. So that's one way in which you see this kind of agency. I mean, also in the marriage proposal, or not the marriage proposal, the pre-marriage proposal, you see a strong emphasis on a woman seeing particular qualities in a man that she thinks will be good for her father's business. Okay, so that's this inner discernment. So there's all these instances.
Assalamu alaikum. I don't know if you looked at all at the creation story with the wording of the creation of Hawa. Is it from Adam or is it from Nafsan Wahida? And it becomes a really big thing. And then, of course, the hadith, which I don't know if you looked at the hadith about.
Yeah, so this point has been covered so well in contemporary literature about. So I talk a lot about the Nafsan Wahida in terms of the metaphysical reality of azwaj, and what that entails about then relationships between embodied men and women. And for me, there's quite good scholarship already out there on this particular point. But I think for me, it was just discovering more of that emphasis on azwaj as partners and a pair, and we talk about parity. That to me just kept coming out over and over again.
Assalamu alaikum. What I would like to ask, and I'm kind of touching on the same thing that this sister talked about, what does woman in the Quran really means? What does it mean to society, to humanity? Because the Quran says Allah created male and female from the same nafs wahida. And another thing that I'd like for you to comment on is that the idea of woman can be symbolic of society, and a corrupt woman is a corrupt society. And so basically we know that the Quran is guidance for humanity, for the human being, for the human family. So could you please give me a perspective of, in general, what does woman mean in the Quran? Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. I think we make a little bit of a mistake when we focus too categorically on like woman and man, because that's just one of the many kind of differentiated human relationships that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is speaking about in the Quran. And so I'm focusing on it, and at the same time I'm saying that there's so many similarities in the treatment that it's almost as if I think we as societies sometimes, and Muslim communities specifically, sometimes I think over-accentuate differences and then we under-accentuate the similarities. And I think that comes out in somewhat detrimental ways sometimes. So setting up double standards that really should just be a single standard, or assuming that girl children do not have the same capabilities, for instance, to acquire ilm as boys do, or like all kinds of these ideas that I've personally seen in my time. And so I would say the aspects of womanhood that are unique really center on this creative capacity and this sustaining capacity to that have to do with not just bringing about life in a literal sense, but about sustaining like a creative force in the world. And that's, I mean, that to me, it's I'm trying to put words to something that I don't have words for yet. But it's that sense that if prophetic figures, for instance, are doing the work of transmitting the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I see a lot of the women figures, women in general, doing like this, like carrying the burdens of like life itself in a way, and I don't know how to say it in like concrete terms, but it is that tied to the rahmah, tied to the rahim, tied to the womb, tied to that generative force, and so that's where I see it's subtle, right? Like the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like how do we describe the mercy of Allah? We can only describe its effects. You know what I'm trying to say here? I'm struggling for the words, but like if I asked you about the mercy of Allah, you might say, oh yeah, this instance in my life where this happened or this happened or this happened. But what is that thing called mercy? How do you tap into that? And this is something about the essence of like of womanhood. It's almost unspeakable in a way, and that's I think why sometimes as societies we have trouble valuing that, because it is so subtle and it can be so powerful, but it can also be so very easily overlooked, shut out, cut off, squashed, and so that's I think what I'm trying to do in this process is on like some kind of very deep level, like try to find words for like what is this thing that women are doing that is so hard to put words to. If you all have ideas, I'll credit you in footnotes.
Assalamu alaikum. Jazakumullah khairan. Thank you for your speech and presentation. So, mashallah, obviously you've done a lot of research within the Qur'an about women and their role in Islam and society and things like that. And I was just wondering if you've looked into the Bible or other traditions and seen the role of women there, or how women are presented or approached in other traditions to see if how they compare and things like that.
For a good part of the time, Jazakallah khairan for the question, for a lot of the time that I was writing this work, I was teaching at a rabbinical school, which provided this wonderful opportunity to be in dialogue with other serious students of knowledge. And given that our stories are many of them shared, that to me was a really rich time. And I decided very on in this work that I wasn't going to touch a comparative focus at all. And that decision was not because there wasn't a lot to say, but again, one of those questions of, I'm going to leave that to either another book or another person entirely. I've personally found so much enrichment sitting with rabbis or rabbis in training and looking at text. And sometimes it's only in reading Hebrew scriptures that I see more subtle points in the Qur'an. I'll give you an example. So when the Ahl of Pharaoh pulls Musa out of the river, in Hebrew scriptures it's explicitly said it's the daughter of Pharaoh. And I found it really interesting because the Qur'an goes right away from Musa being pulled out of the river right away to Asiyah saying, can we keep him, essentially. And in my mind, I always thought, oh, Hebrew scriptures say it was the daughter who kind of like rescued him. The Qur'an says it was the wife of Pharaoh who rescued him. Here's a difference. And then when I went back and did that deeper textual work, I said, oh wait, the Ahl is pulling him out, which maybe the wife of Pharaoh was present there, maybe the daughter of Pharaoh was present there. But when I saw that, okay, these stories, at first I thought they were making disparate truth claims, and then I saw that in digging a little deeper, then I saw that maybe these stories are more complementary than I at first saw. And there's other examples of that too. But I would encourage all of you, if you know serious students of Hebrew Bible, to have them as have you heard of the concept of havruta? It's like that concept of having a study partner who you really dig deep with, and sometimes you argue with, and sometimes you're like in this reciprocal relationship of studying together. And that, to me, from these years working at the rabbinical school, the value of that type of long-term study partner with whom you challenge each other to grow was so valuable. So I encourage you all to find those types of relationships with other Muslims, but also people who are learned in their other faith traditions as well, because oftentimes in teaching, you also learn things in a new way. So when you work together, it opens the hearts, I think, in a beautiful way.
Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah khair for your lecture. So my question is, how can women in today's time take inspiration from women figures in the Qur'an, specifically Maryam alayhi salam?
Specifically?
Maryam alayhi salam.
I think that in different phases of life, there's different figures that one might gravitate towards to kind of whatever, not just stages of life, meaning, kind of life markers, but also stages of spiritual development might be different figures. And so if I'm having a moment where I'm particularly feeling, maybe I'm alone and I'm feeling this like a tremendous connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's, this is like a moment where I can connect to the figure of Maryam alayhi salam. But then if I'm having a moment where I'm having to say something really unpopular, to a group of people or something, Maryam is also that figure who had to do something very difficult socially as well. Maryam is also the figure who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave her a burden that seemed too big in her mind for her to carry, and then she had to figure out a way to do that. So just taking the figure of Maryam, there's all different points in her own life, in her own spiritual development, different struggles that she faced. And even that sense of, Ya Allah, why am I facing this right now? This is too great for me. How do I even find a way through this particular challenge? Then you can look to Maryam alayhi salam as someone who faced tremendous challenges, but also received an immense status and immense rewards because of that. By the way, Maryam twice is mentioned in the Qur'an as chosen, right? She's chosen among all the women of the world, but the Qur'an emphasizes the chosenness twice. And for me, one of the ways that I explained, I told this to the women this morning, one of the ways that I explained for myself why there's only one woman mentioned by her personal name by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Qur'an is that Maryam is also chosen in that respect too. And so that to me was a part of her uniqueness that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala emphasizes. Thank you.
Just to mention, we'll take one more question and then it's time to close.
Assalamu alaikum. So this is a question not necessarily related to the content of your talk, but you talked about your experience as a convert and your experience with the Qur'an. And so I was wondering, I imagine that, being a student of Islamic knowledge as a convert, you would face an enormous amount of pushback in, whether in Islamic circles or otherwise, and I was wondering how, if you wouldn't mind sharing, and I understand this is very personal, but how you maybe took ownership of your role, both in your doctoral studies and otherwise, and then if you have any advice to female reverts in academia, whether those are students of Islamic sciences or otherwise.
That's a beautiful question. Oftentimes the last question, and if they say this doesn't relate to what you've said at all, it's usually about the hijab, but fortunately I knew you weren't going to ask me about that, so. There's two things that I think Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has taught me about, in reference to your question. One is that to stay as humble as possible and to stay as strong as possible, both at the same time. And that's the sense of developing a conviction that I do have something to say, that my voice is important, that I can contribute to this discussion, that even somewhat of a determination that I'm not going to be shut out and I'm not going to be kind of dismissed. But then at the same time, balancing that type of determination is that sense of, Ya Allah, I'm a baby in Islamic learning. I don't know if I'm right or wrong. I'm just kind of hypothesizing, and inshallah correct me if I'm right or wrong. That type of, the balance between having and maybe it's something about the vulnerability as well, that if I trust that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to support whatever, if I set out with a right intention, then inshallah Allah will support it. And that, to me, I always go back to that anytime I'm doubting or just trying to figure out what my role is. And I say over and over again in my mind, Ya Allah, if you put me in this situation, you're going to give me the tools to figure it out. And that's always been the driving force of the scholarship too. You have to, if you're doing scholarship, you have to have some type of confidence that you're going to, inshallah, have something to say that will be of value to someone, inshallah. And I never have very high expectations, but that, to me, that prayer of Ya Allah, make me beneficial to people, and for me, that path has been somewhat through scholarship, inshallah. So maybe that's a good place to end, to pray that, Ya Allah, may we forgive us for anything that we've said that is wrong, and put our feet firmly on the path of knowledge and of faith and of iman, and forgive us for all of the bad qualities and replace those with good qualities, Ya Allah. We know you are the all-forgiving and that you love to forgive. Ya Allah, forgive us and have mercy and compassion on us and upon all of those in our life who are suffering, and upon all of the ummah. Ya Allah, raise all the people who are suffering out of their suffering, and lead us out of our ignorances and our bad qualities, and put in our heart the love of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and of all of his companions, his family, and all the righteous people ila yawm al-qiyamah. Ameen. Ya Rabb, bless the people of Zaytuna and make this a place of deep Islamic learning and sohbah. Ameen. Ya Rabb al-Alameen. Wa ahib dawana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Thank you all.